Hello. In this fourth video, we're looking at Sabbath as resistance to coercion. So far in the story, we've journeyed with our imaginations as though we personally were one of the Hebrews who had been liberated from slavery in Egypt and introduced to the remarkable God who had just set us free. We've been given a new way of living that will help us break the habits of slavery and allow us to learn the disciplines and joys of freedom underpinned by the Ten Commandments. Now the story moves on. The immediate episodes that follow depict the bumpy ride of a people who are learning to trust God after a lifetime of abuse. They're faithless, fearful, and constantly tempted to return to Egypt. Like so many abused people, their abusers have successfully convinced them that they are dependent on their abusers, that they can never stand on their own feet or be free. Years of coercion has ingrained a whole way of being into them, and they're struggling to break free of it. But after 40 years in the desert, learning to trust under the patient handling of God, they finally reach the verge of the promised land. At last, they get the chance to leave slavery behind and live free. And here, on the banks of the River Jordan, just before they enter the land, they pause, and Moses receives the commandments again, this time with added nuance and explanatory notes. The story is found in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy being Greek for second copy of the law, and that is what they now receive. And again, the Sabbath is not only central, but this time it's on steroids. God makes it not just a weekly practice, but a whole way of life. Not only is every seventh day a Sabbath, but every seventh year is a Sabbath year, or sabbatical year. In that seventh year, debts are to be remitted, slaves set free, and the land itself is to rest. No ploughing or sowing. And after 7 lots of 7 years, there's a bonus Sabbath year known as Jubilee, when liberty is proclaimed throughout the land, and the land gets to rest for 2 successive years. Why this command to allow the land to rest? Well, the most important answer is that they are not to commoditize nature. In God's regime, nature is not just there for us to consume, it has a value and dignity of its own. Our relationship towards the land is to be the same as God's, to help it to be fruitful and multiply, but for its own sake, not just for our own ends. Hence there are commands about letting the wild animals eat from the land that we have enabled to produce. But there is another answer which is to do with us, ourselves. Having lived all our lives as slaves in Egypt, we're not used to a land that works as well as the land in Israel. When I visited the Holy Land in 2017, what surprised me most was how fertile the land is. All around is desert, but that little strip is one of the most fertile places on earth. It produces 2 harvests a year, and the harvests are nearly always plentiful. How do you deal with a land like that after you've had nothing? The danger is that you get drawn into a cycle of endless productivity. If the land gives you wealth, security, and happiness, the temptation is to work harder and to work the land harder to get more wealth, security, and happiness. Yet that is the very attitude that will destroy your freedom. So we are to extend the Sabbath principle even to the land itself, to resist commoditizing it, and to resist coercion, even of the earth itself. But this goes hand in hand with the forgiveness of debts. It's a curious command, this. If someone wants to borrow from you, the law of Moses commands you to lend to them freely, whatever they need. And you cannot withhold lending, even if it's the day before the sabbatical year begins. So you would have to lend one day and forgive the debt the following morning. It seems crazy. Yet it has an extraordinary effect in a society where borrowing is only permitted when you are in need. It places the risk of poverty not on the poor, but on the rich who are in a position to lend. They are the ones at risk if there are people in the land who are in need by the 7th year. It turns the tables on them, and it means that it's in the interests of the rich to make sure that there are no poor in the land. It cultivates care for the neighbour. And interestingly, in the early chapters of Acts, when the first Christians grapple with the implications of the resurrection, they act out a year of Jubilee. The first church in Jerusalem shared everything in common and gave to everyone as they had need. This was not early socialism, it was the practice of Sabbath, and there were no poor in their community. They recognised that the death and resurrection of Jesus had remitted every debt, restored the creation, and proclaimed freedom throughout the land. But returning to our camp now on the verge of the Jordan, this fleshing out of the Sabbath principle is given to them at the point where they are about to enter the Promised Land. They are about to discover riches beyond their wildest dreams, and they will have to make the adjustment from being slaves to being rulers. Having always been at the bottom of the pile, they will now have people under them. Now God knows that this is a moment of great blessing for them, but also a moment of grave danger. Freedom always carries the risk of lapsing back into tyranny, and tyranny is insidious in the way that it creeps back in. So to avoid the danger, they are to practice the Sabbath as resistance to coercion. They're to avoid imitating the behaviour of Pharaoh, now that they are rulers themselves. To coerce someone is to consume them, to rob them of their dignity, and to return them to slavery. They must not re-enslave those whom God has set free. To treat the land as their own to coerce is to coerce the creation itself, but the land for all its riches is only the promised land if they relate to it as God's land, His gift, not their own to consume. So to resist that danger, God gives the following explanatory note, which gives the Sabbath a new dimension, now that they are free. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now that they are free, the Sabbath is for remembrance. That's what will protect the freedom they are now to enjoy. God knows that forgetting is a huge temptation in an affluent life, and forgetting will lead us back to the tyranny and coercion we had left behind. If we forget the bitterness of slavery, we will be inclined to force it on others, and to begin to assume that what we have is a right, not a gift. Commerce encourages such forgetting. It encourages us to believe that what we have earned, and that we deserve it, and that others do not. And that encourages us to obsess over personal wealth creation, where you forget your obligations to your neighbour and to the creation itself. It encourages self-sufficiency, where you forget your dependence on God. In all these things, we simply recreate the pattern of coercion, driving ourselves, our neighbours, and the planet itself into a pattern of insatiable consumption. And in that state, we become like Pharaoh, anxious tyrants driving ourselves to restlessness and leaving the poorest and most vulnerable back at the bottom of the heap again. It is a system where we do steal from our neighbour, where we fail to honour our father and mother and all non-productive members of society. It is a system where we commoditise creation and consume it for our own ends. That is not a way of life, it is a way of death. And Egypt was a way of death. The Egyptians actually worshipped death. But God calls us to life. A society of death will worship youth because life is a wasting asset. But a society of life will honour the elders because all life is sacred. A society of death will squeeze every last ounce out of consumption, out of life. But a society of life does not need to steal from the future in order to consume today. A society of death will hold life cheap and rationalise death in the context of a greater good. But a society of life will do no murder, nor slander, nor anything that seeks to diminish the life of others. A society of death will reduce sex and relationships into little more than a system of mutual consent. But a society of life will honour the unique relationship of marriage because of its sacred capacity to give new life. A society of death can never rest because time is always too short. A society of life can rest and live because to rest in peace is not to be dead, but alive. A land of affluence contains many temptations to become a society of death. We should know, because in many ways that is what we have become ourselves. God clearly wants Israel to avoid taking that path. Now he could achieve that by withholding the blessings of the land and keeping them subservient. But that's not what he wants either. He wants to give us the blessings of freedom and abundance, but also recognises that it's only possible if we take our responsibilities seriously in return. That is what it means to be free. The Sabbath is a day of remembrance. We are to remember why we have this freedom and blessing. We are to remember who we are. We are to remember our obligations to our neighbour and to remember our relationship to God. But such is our capacity for amnesia in a wealthy society that this remembrance needs to be practised every 7 days like clockwork, without fail. It's not enough to subjectivise the Sabbath and mark it as at a time that suits us, as though it was just me time. Even in a society where rest is not possible on the Sabbath, the remembrance is necessary. Only if we do the remembrance every 7 days on the Sabbath can it become a habit, one that breaks the habit of slavery and coercion and develops the habits of freedom. Only then will we have become sufficiently aware of the hallmarks of freedom and the dangers of slavery to avoid slipping back to Egypt. And once we have developed that habit, the Sabbath will break out of the seventh day. It will become a habit on the other 6 days throughout the week, and indeed throughout the 7 years, and even the 7 times 7 years. And the Sabbath makes us richer than any amount of consumption ever could, because it is the gift of God, the gift of the creative earth and of one another. It replaces coercion with equality. On the Sabbath, our worth is not shown in our productivity, our abilities, our wealth, or our status. In rest, we are all alike, and our obligations of care for one another and of the earth itself is renewed. Now, this is particularly important for us because the system of coercion is rife in the modern Western world. Today the Sabbath is buried beneath the demands of 24/7 commerce. The culture of now, when we don't have to wait for anything, earn anything, or go without anything, all comes at a cost. A society capable of maintaining a constant supply of fresh, unseasonal veg, the latest smartphone, or a new car at any time on demand, can only be supported by a huge degree of coercion. And there is a cost to this, a cost which we, the rich, do not pay or even notice, but it is a deadly cost paid by the poorest and by the earth itself. Only occasionally, such as during the COVID pandemic, does the cost to the earth of our over-efficient patterns of consumption become so unsustainable that it forces us to stop and take notice. But how do we stop and take notice more regularly, in a more sustainable way? Practicing the Sabbath is the answer, but it's not an easy answer. How do we break the habits of coercion when they're globalised and ingrained in every aspect of our lives? I try, for example, to avoid shopping on a Sunday, even online, because I'm trying to give others some Sabbath rest. But even if I buy something, say, on Friday online, when it's my day off, it will often be delivered on a Sunday. It's really tricky. But I do at least think that we should try to give consideration to how we can give the gift of freedom on the Sabbath to each other and to the earth itself. Personally, I try not to work on a Sunday. I know that sounds ridiculous for a vicar. I will lead worship on a Sunday or care for the sick, but the rest of the day is for my family, for friends, for fun and for rest. And I try to have fun in a way that treads lightly on the earth. It's not always possible. And of course it's a very fine line between taking the Sabbath seriously and turning it back into rules again. But it does require some discipline to prioritise the Sabbath, not just for ourselves, but also for others. At the very least, we can take the Sabbath as a day of remembrance, remembering that the generosity of nature is not to be coerced in the relentless demand for our consumption. Remembering that if we work, we also coerce our neighbour into working. Remembering not only what it was like to live under the coercive regime of Pharaoh and his endless brick production targets, but also remembering what it is like to live under the God of free will, of generous fruitfulness, of shared fellowship, joy and rest. Remembering above all that to stay free requires us to remit the poverty of others, and that means we must constantly resist the way of coercion. So, some questions for you at home, in your study groups or by yourselves, to help you resist coercion and leave behind the house of slavery. Begin by reading Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 to 10. Now spend some time thinking about or discussing these questions. Question 1. In what ways do we coerce or manipulate others to supply our needs? Think about your personal relationships, your shopping habits, and your work patterns. Question 2. What are the things that erode our freedom and the freedom of others around us? Question 3. In what practical ways might we practice the Sabbath as resistance to coercion, even within the complex demands of 24/7 commerce? Now remember, in all of these things, we are not to beat ourselves up over this. Don't turn the Sabbath back into another reason to feel guilty or to try harder. But do what you can this day to set yourself and your neighbours free. Now let's finish with these words from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 33. Follow the path that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you are entering to possess.
I will wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free. I wish I could give all I'm longing to give. I wish I could live like I'm longing to live. I wish I could do all the things that I can do, though I'm way overdue. I'd be starting anew. Well, I wish I could be like a bird in the sky. How sweet it would be if by my heart I could fly. I'd soar to the sun and look down at the sea. Then I'd sing, 'cause I know, yeah. And I'd sing, 'cause I know, yeah. And I'd sing, 'cause